In the 18th century, the Russians set their sight on bringing back the Byzantine Empire. This made sense in some regards, after all they were both Orthodox nations, and they shared an enemy in the Ottomans. But, of course, to do so, they would have to defeat the Ottoman Empire. Fortunately for them, the Ottomans were on the decline, and the Russians found an ally in Austria, and together they declared war. So this wasn't just the plan of someone sitting in a room, this actually was put into practice. And had it not been for the death of the Austrian Emperor, and also the French Revolution, it could well have succeeded. But before we move on to the video, it's time for Raid Shadow Legends. Now I know many of you will know this, but for those who don't, Raid Shadow Legends is a fantasy-themed turn-based role-playing game. Now let's take a look at the team I'm putting together. We've got Gaelic, who is undoubtedly the best for me, Sniper, who although is one of the higher levels, seems to be picked on by all the opposition and is killed pretty quickly, then my ultimate favourite, Crusader, for obvious reasons. I've already decked him out with kit, but he still needs a little improving. For me then, it's time to unlock another champion. And this month Raid's got a non-stop schedule of summer events and activities. We're talking special fusion events to get brand new legendary champions, tournaments against other players, and much more. Plus they're also releasing 5 new amazing champions. So if you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description. All new players will get 200k silver, 1 XP boost, 1 energy refill, and an ancient shard, so you can summon an awesome champion in-game. Plus all new players will also get a free champion named Konoru. You can find all of these extra rewards here in your inbox for the next 30 days only. So I'll see you in-game. So Russia in the 18th century became a great power in Europe, thanks largely to the efforts of Peter the Great and his victory over Sweden. They already had been expanding east, but now, if they looked to push further west, they essentially had to pick an enemy, or at least a direction to do so. There were 3 major powers that blocked any expansion west: Sweden, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Ottoman Empire. So Russia needed to first of all pick a target, and then form alliances accordingly. However, alliances in the 18th century were a strange affair, and could change on a whim. For instance, in the 1730s, the French and Spanish fought against the Russians, Austrians and Prussians in the Polish War of Succession. 10 years later, France, Prussia and Spain fought against the Austrians, Russians and British in the War of Austrian Succession. Then these alliances shifted in 1756 during the Diplomatic Revolution. This took place just before the 7 Years' War, which saw Prussia and Britain fight against the Austrians, French and Russians. This was all part of the stately quadrille, shifting alliances all designed to keep the balance of power in Europe. Now Russia lost the 7 Years' War, but just because their leader died. This is because they were occupying large sections of Prussia, but then Peter III came to the throne in 1762 and just pulled Russia out of the war because he was an admirer of Prussia. But he didn't rule for very long. He was removed from power by his Prussian wife Catherine the Great later that year, and it's probably no surprise that there was a strong pro-Prussian faction within the royal court. And one of the leaders of this pro-Prussian faction was Nikita Ivanovich Panin. He wanted to create an alliance with Prussia, Sweden and the United Kingdom. The Polish would also be part of this alliance, but would act more like a puppet of the Prussians and the Russians, as they would make sure that their royal candidate would be elected king. And this agreement played a prominent role in the first partition of the Commonwealth in 1772. But this alliance was chiefly aimed at the Austrian-French alliance, and only really Prussia joined it. Then it all began to unravel in 1777, when Panin was replaced by Grigory Potemkin. He completely shifted Russia's focus away from the north and to the south in the Ottoman Empire. And this is when their plans to restore the Byzantine Empire, otherwise known as the Greek Plan, began to take hold. Potemkin and Catherine the Great weren't the first Russians to want to take Constantinople and restore the Byzantine Empire. For instance, Peter the Great, despite often fighting in the north, was allegedly determined to retake it. A German soldier who fought for Peter named Burkhard Christoph von Munich said, "Until the hour of his death, Peter's grand design had always been to conquer Constantinople, to chase the infidel Turks and Tartars out of Europe and thus re-establish the Greek monarchy." Again, as I said before, this makes a bit of sense. Ever since the fall of Constantinople, the Russians began claiming that Moscow was in fact the Third Rome, or in other words, the successors of the Roman Empire. This is also why the kings adopted the title Tsar, which literally just means Caesar. Also, way back in 1472, Ivan III married Princess Sophia of the Byzantine Empire after the fall of Constantinople, and adopted the double-headed eagle as the symbol of Russia. Going back to Peter the Great, he launched the Azov campaigns against the Turks, and captured a port on the Black Sea, putting them slightly closer to their ultimate goal. Then the Ottomans lost more land at the beginning of the 18th century, notably Hungary, marking the beginning of their decline. Then, in the 1730s, the Austrians and Russians united to fight against the Ottomans. During this war, Marshal Munich crossed the Dnieper to try and strike at the Turkish capital, but the Austrians suffered a defeat and withdrew from the war. This is when Russia, under the likes of Panin, focused more towards the north for the next few decades, but then it all changed during the partition of Poland. During this, many Poles fled into the Ottoman Empire, and war between Russia and the Turks broke out in 1768. This was a resounding success for Catherine, who annexed land around the Black Sea and made the Crimean Khanate an independent state. But it was only really independent in name, as it fell largely under Russian influence. Potemkin in fact served in this war, quickly rose through the ranks afterwards, and began to turn Russia's attention south. In between Russia and their newly conquered lands in modern-day Ukraine lay the Cossacks on the wild fields. These once served as a buffer state between the powers, but now it was dividing the Russian Empire. So Potemkin sent forces into the region, destroyed the Cossacks, and renamed the area New Russia. This was clearly a comparison to New England and New France, and highlighted Russia becoming a modern colonial power. Potemkin was then given a free hand in bringing this territory under Russian control. Many Europeans were asked to come and settle in the area, and new towns were created. They then annexed the Crimean Khanate and duplicated the process there. Greeks in particular, as you would expect, were welcome settlers. For instance, one of them was Ioannis Vivakis. He had rebelled against the Ottomans during the War of 1768, and in total, 3,000 Greeks would settle there over the next century. But the largest group of settlers came from neighbouring Romania. Plus, many of the new towns that they created highlighted their ultimate ambition just from their name alone. Odessa in Ukraine, for instance, got its name from the Greek city of Odessos. This was an ancient Greek colony established on the Black Sea, but today it is believed to have been in the same location as Varna in Bulgaria, not modern-day Odessa. Otherwise, there's Kherson, which was named after Chersonius, an ancient Greek colony in Crimea. But just looking at a map of Ukraine, you can see a number of towns ending with the suffix pol, coming from the Greek word for city, polis. There's Sevastopol, Mariupol, Nikopol, and in neighbouring Moldova or Transnistria, there's Tiraspol. Meanwhile, Catherine the Great had already hand-picked the future Byzantine emperor, her own grandson, Grand Duke Constantine. He was born in 1779, and as many of you could probably tell by his name, he was named after Constantine the Great. In fact, when he was born, he was raised by Greek maids, and they made commemorative coins saying "Back to Byzantium" on them. As the British diplomat in Russia said, Prince Potemkin's mind is constantly taken up with the idea of creating an empire in the East. He has managed to fascinate the Empress with these feelings, and she christened the newborn Grand Prince Constantine, gave him as a nursemaid a Greek by the name of Helen, and talks in her own circles about how to place him on the throne of the Eastern Empire. So a new emperor had been selected, a slight fascination with Greek culture and history was spreading across Russia, and all in power wanted to bring back the Byzantine Empire. All they had to do now was retake Constantinople. So in 1787, Catherine the Great went on a trip to Crimea in order to inspect her newly conquered territories. During this trip, it was believed that Potemkin hastily built villages en route to show that the region was developing rapidly. This is where the term Potemkin village comes from, but it was largely just a story. However, on this trip, she met with Joseph II of Austria, and the two agreed to form an alliance aimed at carving up the Ottoman Empire. These two nations were then given their cause for war in 1787, when the Ottomans demanded that the Russians give back their Black Sea territory. So war was declared, and Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest ever generals, led the invasion and captured Ismail on the Danube River. Austria, meanwhile, wasn't having the same level of success, and to make matters worse, the other European powers were unwilling to see Russia and Austria gain so much, and revolutions were springing up across Europe. The French Revolution obviously began in 1789, but also in Austrian-controlled Belgium, people began to rise up. The main threat to Austria, however, appeared to the north, as the Prussians signed a defensive alliance with the Ottomans, and the prospect of fighting a war on two fronts worried the Austrians. And then the Austrian emperor died. The new emperor, Leopold II, was more distracted by events happening over in France, and he decided to make peace, achieving very little in the war. This in turn forced Russia to abandon the war in 1792. Potemkin had already died the previous year, and Catherine died a few years later. Both nations would then become embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars that followed, and the goal of restoring the Byzantine Empire sort of died along with Potemkin and Catherine. Russia continued to fight the Ottomans over the next century, with the ultimate goal of taking Constantinople and securing the Straits. The closest they ever came to taking it was during the War of 1878, when Russian troops had marched south to take Sofia, Edirne, and were poised to take the city itself. But the British Navy rushed to the defense of the Ottomans and pressured the Russians to make peace. Even the Soviets continued to apply pressure on Turkey to allow their ships to pass through the Straits. This, the Turkish Straits crisis, as well as Soviet claims to the eastern parts of Turkey, eventually pushed Turkey into joining NATO. But from Russia's perspective anyway, the dream of restoring the Byzantine Empire died in the 18th century. Now this is just one attempt of many to bring back an old empire. For instance, over the centuries many people tried to bring back the Roman Empire, including Mussolini in the 20th century. Or, of course, there's also been numerous attempts to bring back the Caliphate. But can you think of any lesser known attempts to bring back an old empire? Leave yours in the comments below.